Welcome back to the channel. In two of my prior videos that I've linked below, I refinished the wheels on my 2004 Dodge Viper SRT10, and then I did a follow-up on everything that went wrong during that project and why you should not refinish the wheels on your own. This video is the continuation of that series where we go over how to paint the center caps. I found a method that I think does work for painting the center caps, but before that, I figured out a lot of ways that don't work, and I mean a lot of things that didn't work. With that in mind, let's get started. I realize some viewers are here only because they want to find out what works and they don't care about the other failures, so let's jump into that right away. The method that gave me the best finish on the car was doing this in order. First, stripping down and painting the base color of the wheels exactly like I did in the other video where I did the full refinishing. That meant using the Jasco paint and epoxy remover to remove all the clear coat and epoxy enamel from the face of these, using plastic razor blades to scrape off the bulk of it, and then specific to these center caps, because they have this recessed area, I used a metal brush to get deep in there. Now, I want to note that this has a really textured finish on the inside of those recessed areas. That's why I use a brush, as a plastic razor blade would not have been able to completely pick out the paint from all these little crevices and imperfections. But with that in mind, I was okay with using a brass brush, knowing that it could potentially scratch the surface because I was going to be repainting this. If you're going back for a polished face afterwards and you don't want those micro scratches, I recommend using something softer like a toothbrush or maybe just like a nylon brush. But the metal brush like I used took out all of the junk in there a lot faster. Once the factory clear coat is removed, you can then fill any voids or defects or scratches in the surface using a Bondo, assuming you're going to be painting and not going for that polished look. Obviously, if you Bondo fill it, you want to resand it so it's a flat surface again. Then get everything cleaned off with isopropyl alcohol. I use cotton balls for the really big areas, and I use Q-tips to get into all the fine details in that recessed areas, especially in the corners. Once it's dry, apply masking tape to any areas that you don't want to paint. So to be honest, the only thing I masked was the metal clips in the back that hold this into the actual wheel. Some wheels have a very tight tolerance between the side of the center cap and the actual hole that it goes into, and if you fill that with paint, it'll chip off the paint or it won't fit in properly. But for me, I had enough space there to put a couple layers of paint on the outside and have the center cap still fit, and if I hadn't put paint on that outside edge of the center cap, I would have had this clearly visible polished aluminum ring in the middle of my bronze wheel face. So for me, putting paint on that outside edge of the center cap was definitely necessary. Then you're going to use your base coat of primer, followed by a few top coats of whatever color wheel paint you're deciding to use. So here I'm going with the bronze. The next step only applies if you're adding a different color to the recessed part of the wheel cap. So for example, on my wheel caps, I wanted the Viper logo only to be black and the rest of the wheel cap to be bronze. This is the part that is most difficult, most tedious, and that is most dependent on your actual painting ability. What you'll want to do is get a nail polish that is the color you want, but as I'll show later, the brush that is within the nail polish is going to be way too big to get a bunch of these fine details, especially for something like this where I have like the little Viper eyes that are these tiny little dots. So what you have to do is get a set of really small artist brushes like these. I got these from my local craft store for about $7 for the whole set, and there are 2 or 3 brushes with extremely fine tips in here. This is what you need to be able to get into those sharp corners without making an absolute mess across the entire center cap. Now, I don't have actual video of this just because my memory card completely filled up with my previous failures before I finally got this right, but the technique to do is to take those really fine tip brushes and just very gently dip it into the nail polish. You want 1 or 2 drops worth of nail polish on the end of the brush, and then gently touch it to the area you're trying to fill in the center cap. It should pretty much wick off of the brush and into whatever corner you want, and then use the really fine tip to push it into the fine details if it doesn't flow there naturally on its own. Even though you might have a larger area on your center cap to fill, so for example, the bulk of the snake head here was a little bit more open, only use the smaller brushes. Trust me on this one, it is not worth the risk of having to redo this if you accidentally have a little bit of a spillover using one of the larger and messier brushes. Spend the extra time now so you don't have to redo it later. I also recommend keeping a pile of fresh, clean Q-tips at the ready, so the second that you have anything that goes out of the lines, it is no longer in that recessed area, wipe it up immediately. Do not give it a second to dry up, because the moment that it starts to get tacky, you're pretty much not going to be able to remove it from that surface without also taking off the layer of base paint below it. Pretty much if it dries on there, plan on stripping it and restarting. It might take you 1 or 2 tries to actually get the nail polish to come out correctly. Don't worry about that, you will get the hang of it, you just got to be patient with it. But once it does come out to a point that you're happy with it, you are ready to apply the clear coat. When applying the clear coat, I recommend getting at least 2 to 3 coats on, just so you know that this is going to be well protected, it's not going to chip, and that this this finish is going to last you for years to come, but it's really going to be at your discretion, and you just want to make sure it has the same level of coverage and the same level of gloss as the rest of your wheels, assuming you're redoing everything else at the same time. In the spirit of taking no risks, I let mine sit for a full week before putting them on the car just to make sure they were fully cured and that I wasn't going to have to worry about chipping. But you can remove the masking at any point in that week. Just know that if the masking is touching a painted surface, there is a risk it will peel up the painted surface if you do not pull it up while the paint is still wet. And that is the easiest and best way I have found to make these wheel caps come out as perfect as I could make them. So now let's cover everything that I tried that did not work so well. The first thing I tried to do was mask these so that only the bottom recessed area was showing, so that I could do the black fill first and then come back and do the bronze face on only that topmost surface at the end. A lot of things wrong with this. First is that it was super time consuming. It was about 45 minutes per center cap to trace all these details. And granted, a lot of that is because these Viper wheel caps have a lot of really small surfaces that I was working around. So to get those intricate details was a very tedious thing to do with a razor blade. The other issue is that this was super dependent on the exact angle that you had the blade at. So for example, if you had this thing perfectly upright, so it was like 90 degrees to the surface, and then in a few areas you had maybe a 80-ish degree angle, so you're 10 degrees off of top dead center, it created a noticeably different line in the product afterwards where you could see the black dipping out a noticeable amount by eye in that section where you had that slight angle change of the blade, which means your fine motor skills and your hand control better be absolutely perfect, or the edge around the recessed area is not going to be consistent around the entire center cap. And for me, trying to make these perfect, that was an issue. Next is something that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and that is that the nail polish brush is way too thick to try to hit all of these really intricate details, especially the sharp corners above the eyes on the Viper logo, especially those little fangs in the middle. All of those really tight, small areas, especially the acute angles, you just cannot get into without spilling the nail polish over onto the edges. For a point of comparison, I did one masked center cap with one not masked center cap side by side, just to show how excessive that the brushing area is on this. But even when I peeled off the masking on the one that was masked, what I found was that the edges were a lot better, but the brush still couldn't get into those fine nooks and crannies, so there were areas that were definitely underfilled. The problem being that you have to go back and refill them unless you want that bright silver color to show through on the final product. So again, I tried to do that with only the nail polish brush to see if I could go back and touch it up with just that before I bought the artist brushes. It did not come out good. It overran everywhere and it was a complete disaster. Next, I wanted to see if the masking was necessary to get the sharp lines if you did the inside fill first, or if I could kind of cheat the system, do a lazy job on the masking, and then just do something to clean it up afterwards. So using the same two pieces, what I tried next was to sand the entire top face to remove the extra paint so that only the recessed areas were filled, knowing that all the top surfaces should have been on the same level. And that actually worked pretty well except for two issues. The first being that the sander slipped a little bit and took out a little bit of the nail polish in the big open area in the Viper's head, which means I would have to go back and retouch up this area again. The second problem is that if you do the infill first of the recessed areas, that means you have to mask off the filled area when you're painting the top flat surface with whatever color you're going to use. And just like masking off the top surface to paint the recessed area, masking off the recessed area to paint off the top surface is also super difficult and annoying and not easy to do. I'll come back to masking off the recessed area in a minute, but let's start with what I tried next, which was using an engine enamel instead of my primer and base paint, thinking that this should be a little bit thicker as an enamel than what the base paint would have been, and should have given me comparable coverage and comparable fill to what the nail polish was providing. After stripping the two center caps that I had worked on back down to bare metal, I just roughly outlined the Viper logo so that I wouldn't have to sand down the whole surface. I could only focus on those localized areas using that sanding technique. But even with the relatively thick coating of the engine enamel, it was just not thick enough on its own to cover as well as the nail polish covered. So even if you're using something like this, you still need to do a primer unless you want the base metal to show through, which obviously I did not. I was eventually able to just put enough of this paint on that it got the coverage I wanted, and by doing the rough outline with the masking tape, I was able to sand it down with a lot less effort to get only the recessed areas to have the black at the end. But once again, I experienced the issue where the sander hit that open face in the middle of the Viper head and again caused a thin spot that would have had to be recovered. Because I knew it would have to be stripped down anyway, I wanted to try my next technique before stripping it down because quite frankly, I was not confident that it would work, which is good because it didn't work and I was was right. As I stated earlier, I was really concerned about masking only the recessed areas to then spray the top coat of bronze on just the top flat surface. And if I covered only that inside edge with tape and then I trimmed it with a razor, there was a very high probability that I would hit the coat underneath with the razor blade, scratch it up, and then need to repaint it after already doing the top coat, which would mean masking a new area and then retrimming it with the razor and then risking re-scratching it again, and it could have been an endless cycle. Now keep in mind that I was still recovering from a head injury during filming this, but my partially brilliant but mostly damaged brain said, hey, what if we just fill this with a soft material that's easier to pick out, but that will conform to the recessed areas and make it a little bit easier to mask, which on paper sounded like a brilliant idea, but now that I'm saying it out loud, stuffing Play-Doh into my wheel caps to mask them off probably wasn't the best plan. And actually it wasn't Play-Doh, it was soft tea dough, because that's the only thing I could find in stores near me. This plan was really short-lived because my goal was to just pack it in there and then use a plastic razor blade to skim along the top, thinking that it would just saw it off to be flush with the surface and I would have this perfect masking job with no effort. The problem is it was a little too soft. So first of all, it didn't really cut, but also it kind of pulled at itself as you were trying to cut along the face. So all the areas that were already packed were just getting stretched thinner, thereby taking the masking line back as you went farther along. It also was leaving a very oily residue on the face, and I just knew that that was going to interfere with the adhesion of the paint. So how did my brain damaged self resolve this issue? Not by abandoning the idea, but instead moving on to a thicker version of the same idea because I am that dense. Basically, I repeated the same idea using sculpting clay. It was a little less oily, but had a little bit more firmness to it. So the thought would be that it would stretch out and pull on itself less as I was trying to saw it level with the top surface. The application of this actually did go a lot better, and I was able to get it relatively flat to the surface, but it did still have some oils to it, so I did scrub the crap out of it with isopropyl alcohol to try to de-oil the surface as much as I could. So here's me right before actually spraying it, and even in my voice you can tell I don't have the most confidence in this plan.
So I've only prepped the center cap that had the scuff on the inside of the Viper's face anyway. That way if it goes bad, I've got to redo this one anyhow, so it's not a huge deal. That said, we're going to give this a base coat of primer, then hit it with the bronze over the top. I'm kind of racing the rain right now, and I have no idea if this is going to work, so this will be rather interesting.
On one hand, I'd really like to give myself points for creativity here, but those would be poorly awarded because this did not work. As you can see, the clay was extremely difficult to remove after the paint was over the top of it. I tried a plastic razor as well as just scrubbing it with a Q-tip, thinking that that wasn't going to damage it, but as I quickly figured out, and as you'll see in a second, the masking line it provided was not perfect. It definitely affected the adhesion of the top coat, but it also affected the base layer underneath and made the colors come out a little bit weird, probably because of the oils that were in it, but either way, I was really not happy with the colors after removing the clay. What I tried next, and what I'm describing in the original video using way more words than necessary, is that before I stripped this wheel, I put a little bit of nail polish on the bronze face, and then I tried different techniques to see if there was anything that would remove the nail polish without removing the bronze paint below it. The reason being is if I could fill in the black after doing the bronze paint, and I knew there was something that would only remove the black paint on top, it would be an easy cleanup job. Then I could be sloppy with the nail polish on the fill-in and then just clean up the edges with very little effort. I'm conducting that test here, and I started with isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips, thinking that that would be one of the less abrasive things I could use relative to like acetone or sandpaper, but even that with a little bit of force was enough to remove the bronze paint as well. Here in this close-up shot you can see a lot of discoloration and inconsistencies in the shade of bronze, but the green primer, which as I described in the other video was the absolute bane of this project, is actually showing through in several areas here, especially around the edges, simply because the bronze paint completely rubbed away. Because this is the closest I was so far to getting these to look good, I wanted to see if I could actually salvage these without stripping them down again. So what I tried next was, rather than taking a lazy way to mask off the recessed areas, seeing if I could actually do it by using masking tape and a razor blade. Like I said in the start, this was very fine motor skill and very tedious, and it took a lot of time, but fortunately I learned from my earlier mistakes, and I realized that I shouldn't do all four of them like this until I knew it worked with one of them. I'm going to cut to the original audio here simply so I can document the fact that I do in fact learn from my mistakes from time to time, and that I am not an untrainable monkey as some people have claimed.
Yesterday I spent a significant amount of time trying to get these masked. I finished the first one and I'm probably about a third, not quite a halfway through the second one, but before I went through and finished these obviously take quite a bit of time, so I wanted to make sure this actually worked as a masking method prior to doing the rest of these. These probably took about 45 minutes to an hour each, and it's very detailed, meticulous work. So doing them all back to back is not really easy because you're just not going to have consistent quality from when you start to when you finish, just because of the fatigue alone of doing that much fine motor work.
There you have it, documented proof that I can actually learn. I went on to say that I was concerned that the masking tape left a residue on the face and that would affect the paint, and that I was concerned I wouldn't be able to remove the rest of the masking afterwards without damaging the coating underneath, kind of like the issue I had when I used the play-doh in the clay to do the masking. So once again, my confidence was not high in the technique I was about to perform, but YOLO, send it, we're gonna go for it. Which was the right mindset to have because it didn't come out the best, and the small chipped paint by the edges of the recessed area were still visible in the top coat because I didn't properly blend them in with sandpaper. But because I was going to have to redo this anyhow, I continued with trying to pull off the masking as if it was the final job, just to see if it could be done with good results and whether or not this would be worth pursuing the next time I refinished it. And to nobody's surprise, it is not worth pursuing this as a technique. The reasons being, one, that the paint left a residue and lifted up a little bit of the nail polish and both matted the finish but also removed a little bit of the material and left this weird dull textured surface. But second, that the plastic razor blade to pick out the masking, not only did it damage and remove some of the nail polish in the recessed areas, it was also enough to damage the top coat of bronze on the top surface of the center cap as well. So basically, once there is paint on the surface, you can't even use the plastic razor blade unless you want to paint it over again. Fortunately, this is also the point in the main project where I swapped from the green primer that I absolutely hated to the black primer that worked really well. So I had to redo these either way to get the color to match with the rest of the wheels. But as I was going over what I already tried that worked and didn't work, I had my next stroke of genius slash brain injury thought that gave me the next technique I was going to try.
All the center caps are stripped down again, and what I tried last time was after painting everything and putting in the nail polish, I wiped it off with isopropyl and I found that it wore through the bronze top coat. So that got me thinking, well, what if it didn't wear through the top coat? It probably would have been okay. So what can I do to prevent it from doing that if I were to try this again? So what I'm going to try today, and this is the only solution I really came up with, prime it, paint it with the bronze, clear coat it with several coats of clear to build up a thick layer, then paint the recesses with the nail polish and come back and wipe it with isopropyl. My thought is that with enough clear coat on this, even if I wear through the clear coat, it won't get all the way down to the bronze, and I'll respray it with clear at the end anyhow, one to lock in that nail polish and then two to replenish any of the clear coat that we wore away from wiping it away. So I'm going to mask off here on the bottom with the clips again, then we are going to start spraying these.
If you already watched the first few minutes of the video, you know that of course this technique did not work. So maybe I am an untrainable monkey, but in my head it made sense at the time. As such, I started by reapplying the nail polish using the brush that I already determined was way too thick. I tried to repeat the earlier technique using the isopropyl to clean up the edges, and I also tried using a 400 grit sandpaper with extremely light finger pressure just to clean up the edges. But what I figured out with both of those very quickly is that the black nail polish is just way more durable than what the bronze paint can offer. So regardless of how light you're pressing, regardless of what cleaning material you're using, the nail polish is just not going to dissolve and is not going to get removed before the bronze paint below it gets removed. I then made what was probably my smartest move in this entire project and gave up. Not even joking, I gave up on painting the center of these black, and here is the audio of it happening. I will not be making any more attempts to make these black on the center. I think it is beyond my skill and capability level, therefore I will not be doing it.
I know I said I was done attempting to paint these, but I was actually done attempting to paint these. I had my girlfriend paint these, and what she did is used the nail polish in a very small brush, like an artist brush, and then manually painted them that way. So I think they look pretty good. What we're going to do now is do a final clear coat with the wheel enamel. That should seal everything in, prevent that from chipping over time. Then these are ready to go on the car.
There you have it, gentlemen. If you do not have the fine motor skills to do some very minute details of painting, find someone artsy, ask them to do it. Done deal. Make your life way easier. I should have done that from the start. Like I said in the start of the video, I recommend at least 3 coats of clear to really lock in the nail polish and prevent chipping long term. But at this point, praise whatever god you have because you are done at last. And with the level of difficulty I had of getting this done and having it look right, I did not want to take any chances about having these chipped. So I waited a full week for these to fully cure before I put them on the car. And the final problem of this project is that my brain was so fried from how much work that this took, and also, you know, from the head injury, that I forgot to check the camera settings when I was doing the installation. So I didn't take a video, I didn't take a time lapse, I took a single picture thinking that my camera was set that up. In classic fashion of all my projects not going as planned, the closing to this video is going to be way less of a dramatic install than I was hoping it would be. But you know what? If I can deal with more than 80 hours to repaint some wheels, you can deal with an anticlimactic ending to a YouTube video. All my sympathy has been replaced by gray hair at this point. I am so glad this project is done. So with that, now you know not only what to do, but definitely what not to do. Hopefully this helped you guys out. Best of luck if you're trying this on your own. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.